When I was 18 years old, I made one decision that shattered the illusion that bad things only happen to other people. It started with something so unbelievably stupid that even now I struggle to admit it out loud. Two friends and I walked into Walmart late on a Friday evening, joking around, convincing ourselves that we were untouchable. Someone dared me to steal a phone. We laughed about how easy it would be. I told myself it wasn't a real crime if I could simply slip it into my hoodie and disappear before anyone noticed. That single thought destroyed the next several years of my life. I carefully peeled open the packaging, slid the phone into my pocket, and began walking toward the exit. My heart was racing, but I kept telling myself to stay calm. Smile. Don't look nervous. Just another customer heading home. I never even made it through the front doors. A hand landed firmly on my shoulder. "Sir, we'd like you to come with us." Those words still echo inside my head. Loss prevention had been watching me the entire time. Every movement, every glance, every second I believed I was invisible. Within minutes, the police arrived. My hands were pulled behind my back, cold steel cuffs snapped shut around my wrists, and suddenly the parking lot I'd walked into an hour earlier as an ordinary teenager looked completely different. Families pushed shopping carts to their cars while children laughed nearby. People stared as officers escorted me across the pavement. I wanted the ground to open beneath me. I kept thinking someone would explain it away. Maybe I'd get a citation. Maybe they'd lecture me. Maybe my parents would pick me up and we'd never speak of this again. Instead, I was fingerprinted, photographed, questioned, processed. Every step stripped away another piece of my dignity. Then one officer looked up from his paperwork and said something that made my stomach collapse. "Court doesn't open until Monday." It was Friday night. You'll be spending the weekend in county. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. A weekend. In jail. Over a phone. The realization hit me harder than the handcuffs ever had. Panic doesn't always arrive with screaming. Sometimes it arrives quietly, settling into your chest until every breath feels too small. I had never been suspended from school, never been arrested, never even spent a night away from home without knowing exactly when I'd return. Now I was being escorted through heavy steel doors that slammed shut behind me, with a sound I have never forgotten. If you've never heard a jail door lock from the inside, it's impossible to describe. It doesn't just close. It announces that your freedom no longer belongs to you. The booking process felt endless. They emptied my pockets, removed my belt, my shoes, my wallet, my phone, even my clothes. Standing there while strangers inventoried every possession I owned was humiliating in a way I never imagined possible. Then they handed me an orange jumpsuit. It looked ordinary in the officer's hands. It felt like a life sentence in mine. As I changed, I caught my reflection in a scratched metal mirror. The scared kid staring back at me barely looked like the same person who had walked into Walmart laughing with his friends. That version of me no longer existed. When they finally escorted me into the holding area, another wave of reality crashed over me. I didn't belong there, or at least that's what I desperately wanted to believe. The room was crowded with men whose faces carried stories they never had to tell. Scarred knuckles, prison tattoos, broken noses, eyes that seemed permanently exhausted. Some laughed loudly, trading stories as if jail were nothing more than another inconvenient stop in life. Others sat silently watching everyone who entered, watching me. The moment I walked in, conversation slowed. Several heads turned. One man smirked. Another whispered something that made the group laugh. Then someone called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Look what we got here. Pretty boy." Laughter erupted across the room. Heat rushed into my face. I stared at the floor because making eye contact somehow felt even more dangerous. Fear has a smell. I never believed that before. But that room smelled of sweat, bleach, stale concrete, and something heavier desperation that had settled into the walls after years of people passing through them. Every instinct told me not to stand out. Don't speak. Don't stare. Don't look weak. Don't look scared. The problem was, I was terrified, and everyone could see it. Hours later, another group of newly arrested men arrived and the guards announced we could make phone calls. My hands were shaking as I dialed home. My mother answered on the second ring. "Honey." The sound of her voice nearly broke me. Everything I'd been holding together came apart inside my chest. I explained where I was, what I'd done. The silence that followed hurt more than any punishment could have. Then my father took the phone. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't ask what I had been thinking. His disappointment carried more weight than anger ever could. "We've already contacted an attorney," he said quietly. "You'll probably see the judge Monday morning." Monday. That word suddenly felt like another lifetime away. When the call ended, I stood there holding a dead receiver, wishing I could hear my parents' voices one more time before stepping back into that room. Instead, I walked back into the day area, pretending I wasn't seconds away from falling apart. That night, they assigned me to a cell. The officer unlocked the door and nodded toward the man already sitting on the lower bunk. He looked to be somewhere in his 40s. Broad shoulders, weathered face, gray beginning to creep into his beard. "My name's Bob," he said calmly. Oddly enough, hearing someone speak in a normal voice made me relax. Compared to the shouting outside, he almost seemed comforting. He asked what I was in for. Embarrassed, I admitted the truth. He chuckled softly. "Kid, that's nothing. For a while, I believed I had been lucky." He explained how meals worked, when the guards counted inmates, why I should avoid arguments, how to keep my head down. He sounded less like a criminal and more like someone giving survival advice. Little by little, my guard came down. That was my first mistake. As the hours crawled by, his questions became increasingly personal. Where exactly did I live? Did I have a girlfriend? What school did I attend? Did my parents leave me home alone much? Was I planning to go to college? Every answer I gave seemed to encourage another question. When I became vague, he smiled. Not a friendly smile. A patient one, like someone waiting for a locked door to slowly open. Then came the compliments. "You look younger than 18. You've got one of those innocent faces. You definitely don't belong in a place like this." The words themselves weren't threatening. The way he said them was. His eyes stayed on me longer than they should have. He laughed at things that weren't funny. He slowly began closing the distance between us whenever we talked. One time he sat so close our shoulders nearly touched. I shifted away. A few minutes later, he moved closer again. Then, while laughing at one of his own stories, he casually rested his hand on my shoulder. Too long. Long enough for every nerve in my body to scream. I froze. When he finally removed it, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Minutes later, he reached over again. This time, his hand landed on my knee. Not by accident. Not for balance. He left it there. I immediately stood up and moved to the opposite side of the tiny cell. Bob didn't apologize. He didn't act embarrassed. Instead, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even an amused smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how uncomfortable he had made another person and enjoyed every second of it. That expression chilled me far more than any shouting from the day room ever had. From that moment on, every time the heavy steel door slammed shut behind us, my pulse exploded. The walls suddenly felt smaller. The air felt thinner. The silence between us became unbearable. I stopped sleeping deeply. Every tiny sound, the scrape of a shoe, the rustle of a blanket, the creak of metal bunks jerked me awake. Whenever the cell doors opened for recreation or meals, I was one of the first people to step outside. The chaotic day room, filled with shouting strangers and constant noise, somehow became the safest place in the entire jail. Because no matter how frightening the crowd was, it was still better than being locked inside that tiny concrete box with a man whose smile haunted me far more than the bars ever did. Looking back now, the jail itself wasn't the scariest part of that weekend. It wasn't the concrete walls. It wasn't the locked doors. It wasn't even the humiliation of being arrested. The true horror was realizing how quickly one reckless decision can place you inches away from people whose intentions remain hidden behind ordinary conversations, calm voices, and seemingly harmless smiles. Sometimes the monsters don't raise their voices. Sometimes they don't threaten you. Sometimes they simply wait until there is nowhere left for you to go. Time stopped meaning anything inside that jail. Without sunlight, without fresh air, without even a glimpse of the outside world, every hour dissolved into the next until 48 hours felt like 48 years. The fluorescent lights overhead never truly shut off. They merely dimmed enough to remind you that sleep was a privilege no one intended for you to have. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt them snap open again minutes later. Not because of the noise, not because of the cold concrete floor, because I couldn't shake the feeling that Bob was watching me. You know that strange sensation everyone experiences at least once, the unmistakable certainty that someone is staring at you even though you can't prove it. Imagine living inside that feeling. One night, I say night because my body told me it was not, because there was any way to know I woke suddenly for no reason at all. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light. Then I saw him. Bob wasn't asleep. He was leaning slightly over the edge of the top bunk, his face hanging just enough that I could make out his eyes. They were fixed directly on me. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply watched. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then, almost casually, he smiled. "Can't sleep either," he whispered. His voice was calm. Too calm. like we were roommates sharing a college dorm instead of two strangers locked inside a concrete box. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Something deep inside me screamed that responding would somehow make things worse. I rolled over pretending to fall back asleep, but every muscle in my body remained tense for the rest of what felt like an endless night. I could hear him shifting above me every few minutes, sometimes breathing, sometimes completely silent. The silence was somehow worse. By Monday morning, I looked like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. Dark circles under my eyes, hands trembling, mind completely exhausted. When they finally escorted me into the courtroom, I barely listened to anything the judge said. I wasn't thinking about charges. I wasn't thinking about fines. I wasn't thinking about my future. I was thinking about one thing: getting out. The moment I heard the word released, I nearly collapsed from relief. A few hours later, my father picked me up. The ride home was almost completely silent. I expected yelling. I expected disappointment. Instead, there was something harder to face: compassion. My dad looked over at me once and quietly asked if I was okay. I lied. Yeah, I wasn't. Not even close. I wanted to scrub every memory of that weekend out of my skin. I took the longest shower of my life. I threw away the clothes I had been arrested in. I slept for nearly 14 hours straight. When I woke up, I convinced myself it was over. I was wrong. 3 days later, while scrolling through Instagram, I noticed a follow request from an account I didn't recognize. At first glance, it looked fake. New real name. No posts. No followers. No following. The profile picture wasn't a person. It looked like a dark room photographed in almost complete darkness. Something about it made me uneasy. Still, random fake accounts weren't unusual. I ignored it. That night, my phone buzzed. Direct message. Same account. Without thinking, I opened it. My blood turned to ice. It was a selfie. Bob's face filled almost the entire screen. The camera was held far too close, making his smile look distorted. It was the exact same smile he'd worn inside that cell, the one that never reached his eyes. Underneath the picture were only 3 words: "Miss you already." I couldn't breathe. My hands instantly went numb. I blocked the account so quickly that I nearly dropped my phone. Then I actually did throw it across my bed, as though simply touching it might somehow connect me back to him. A terrifying realization settled into my mind. He knew my name, my real name. I had never told him my last name. I had never mentioned social media. So how had he found me? I spent the next several hours checking every privacy setting on every account I owned. Nothing made me feel safer. Because once someone finds you once, who's to say they can't do it again? 2 days passed. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Then came the afternoon that erased any hope of that. It was cold. A thick layer of fog covered the neighborhood, turning familiar houses into vague silhouettes. When I pulled into my driveway after work, I immediately noticed an old weathered sedan parked across the street. Its faded paint looked almost gray beneath the cloudy sky. The engine wasn't running. The windows were slightly tinted. Someone sat inside, head lowered, completely motionless. They didn't check their phone, didn't smoke, didn't look around. They simply sat there, watching, or waiting. I stayed inside my own car for almost a minute, pretending to search for something in the passenger seat while secretly studying the vehicle. No movement, no explanation. Finally, I grabbed my backpack, hurried inside, and locked the front door behind me. Click. Deadbolt. Shane. For several minutes, You've been through something traumatic. You're paranoid. You're seeing danger where there isn't any. Then I heard it. Not a knock. Not the doorbell. The doorknob, slowly turning, back and forth. Metal scraping softly against metal. Someone wasn't announcing themselves. Someone was checking whether the door was locked. Every hair on my arm stood up. The sound stopped. Silence. I held my breath. Maybe they'd left. Maybe. The back door. The exact same sound. Slow patient. Testing. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to break in. Not yet. They were learning the house. Learning me. That's when instinct finally overpowered denial. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Ironically, only days after being arrested myself, I found myself begging the police for help. My voice dropped to barely a whisper. I'm in my house. I think someone's trying to get inside. The dispatcher stayed calm, asked for my address, asked if I could see the person. Before I could answer, ding the doorbell. One single chime, perfectly timed, as if whoever stood outside somehow knew I was already on the phone. The dispatcher asked again if I could look through the window. No, I couldn't. Every instinct screamed not to go anywhere near that door. Then I heard myself saying words I never imagined I would. I think it's the guy. The man I shared a jail cell with. The dispatcher immediately instructed me to stay hidden until officers arrived. Those next few minutes felt endless. Every tiny creak in the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind outside sounded like someone breathing. When patrol cars finally pulled into the driveway, the old sedan was gone. The porch was empty. No footprints. No broken locks. Nothing. Almost as if whoever had been there knew exactly how much time they had before disappearing. I told the officers everything. The arrest. The weekend in jail. Bob, the Instagram message. The strange car. The doorknobs. The silence. I watched their expressions carefully. The moment I admitted I had recently been in jail, everything changed. They weren't openly rude, but I could almost see the skepticism settling into their faces. One officer folded his arms. "Are you sure you're not just shaken up from the experience?" Another asked whether I'd somehow given Bob my last name. No, I hadn't. Not intentionally. The officers filed a report, gave me a case number, promised to keep an eye out. Then they left. The house felt even emptier after they drove away. For the next week, nothing happened. No messages. No strange cars. No knocks. Gradually, I convinced myself the nightmare had ended, until Friday night. Some friends invited me to a local dive bar. None of them knew about the arrest. None of them knew about Bob. For the first time in days, I laughed. I almost felt normal again. Music echoed through the room. Pool balls cracked across green felt. People shouted over cheap beer and loud conversations. Then, completely by accident, I glanced toward the far corner of the bar. Time stopped. Sitting alone beneath a flickering neon sign was a man wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Most people wouldn't have looked twice. I recognized him instantly. Bob. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't talking. He wasn't playing pool. He was simply sitting there, looking directly at me. And then, impossibly slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted into that same familiar smile, the one I'd hoped never to see again. The one that made the crowded bar suddenly feel just as confining as that tiny concrete jail cell. In that moment, one terrifying realization settled into my mind. Getting released from jail hadn't ended my nightmare. It had only changed its address. At first, Bob wasn't even looking at me. He sat alone in the darkest corner of the bar, almost blending into the shadows beneath a flickering neon beer sign. His baseball cap was pulled low, hiding most of his face, and from a distance, he looked like just another tired customer nursing a drink after work. For one brief, fragile moment, I convinced myself I was mistaken. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe my mind had become so conditioned by fear that I was seeing monsters and strangers. Then he slowly lifted his head. Our eyes met. Recognition spread across his face almost instantly. "And then?" He smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not the kind of smile someone gives after unexpectedly recognizing an old acquaintance. It was the exact same smile he wore every time he pushed just a little too close inside that jail cell. Patient, confident, possessive. The smile of someone who already knew he had crawled into your thoughts long before you noticed him. Every ounce of blood seemed to drain from my body. My heartbeat became so loud I could barely hear the music blasting through the speakers. The room suddenly felt smaller. The laughter around me faded into distant echoes. It was as if everyone else had disappeared, leaving only the two of us locked in another invisible cage. One of my friends noticed immediately. "Dude, what's wrong?" I forced myself to look away. If Bob realized how terrified I was, I somehow believed he'd enjoy it even more. My voice barely sounded like my own. "There's someone here I don't want to deal with." I didn't dare tell them the truth. How do you explain that the man who shared your jail cell had somehow found you again? How do you explain that you spent days wondering whether you're being followed without sounding completely paranoid? Instead, I lied. "I really don't want to run into an ex. Can we leave?" They laughed, assuming it was ordinary relationship drama. If only it had been. We headed toward the exit. Every step across that crowded bar felt painfully slow. I resisted every urge to turn around. Part of me desperately wanted to look. The other part was terrified of what I might see. Would he still be sitting there? Would he be following us? Would he already be standing behind me? When we finally stepped outside into the cool night air, I immediately scanned the parking lot. Rows of parked cars stretched into the darkness. Every shadow suddenly looked like a hiding place. Every passing stranger made my pulse jump. I kept expecting the heavy door behind us to swing open. I pictured Bob calmly walking out, following us, calling my name. He never appeared, at least not where I could see him. Trying to hide how badly my hands were shaking, I told my friends I'd just order an Uber instead of driving. In reality, I didn't want to be alone, not even for 30 seconds. I asked them to stay until my ride arrived. Neither of them questioned it. The longest 8 minutes of my life passed in complete silence. Every pair of headlights made me flinch. Every engine that started nearby made me spin around. Every shadow felt alive. The moment the Uber finally arrived, I practically dove into the back seat. Before the driver had even pulled away from the curb, I called my parents. This time, I told them everything. Not just the arrest, not just Bob. Everything I had been too ashamed or too frightened to admit. The Instagram account, the selfie, the message, the strange car outside our house, the doorknobs turning, seeing him inside the bar. For several seconds after I finished speaking, neither of my parents said a word. Then my father quietly said something that immediately told me this was no longer something we could pretend would disappear on its own. We're going to the police. That night we drove straight to the precinct together. Everything felt different this time. I wasn't an embarrassed teenager standing alone after making a terrible mistake. I was someone genuinely afraid. With my parents beside me and screenshots of Bob's message saved on my phone, the officers listened differently. They reviewed the Instagram account. They documented the attempted break-in. They photographed the messages. They asked detailed questions. For the first time since leaving jail, someone actually believed me. I signed a sworn statement. The process took hours. Eventually, I was granted a temporary restraining order. During the investigation, I learned something that sent another chill through my body. Bob wasn't even his real name. It had been an alias from the very beginning. To this day, I refuse to say his actual name. Some names deserve to stay buried. Investigators also explained something I had never considered. After someone is arrested, surprising amounts of information can become publicly accessible through booking records, court filings, or inmate databases. They couldn't prove exactly how he had found me. Neither could I. But the pieces fit together too perfectly to ignore. He had learned my first name inside the jail. After his release, he probably searched public records until he found enough information to identify me. From there, finding my social media wasn't difficult. Finding my house apparently wasn't either. The restraining order seemed to work. After it was served, Bob disappeared from my life as suddenly as he had entered it. I never received another message. Never saw another suspicious car. Never caught another glimpse of him across a crowded room. But fear doesn't disappear just because the danger does. For years afterward, I caught myself checking over my shoulder in parking lots. I looked twice before unlocking my front door. I kept my social media private. Whenever an unfamiliar account followed me, I felt that same knot tighten inside my stomach. People often assume the worst part of getting arrested is the criminal charge, the embarrassment, the fines, the permanent record. For me, none of those things compare to what happened afterward. The real punishment wasn't the weekend behind bars. It was realizing that one reckless decision placed me inside a locked concrete room with someone who never should have crossed paths with me, and then unknowingly gave that person just enough information to reach back into my life after I walked free. Freedom, I learned, doesn't always begin the moment the jail doors open. Sometimes the bars follow you home. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone this story. Writing these words now still makes my chest tighten. Every detail drags me back into those sleepless nights, those silent stares, and that smile I can still picture with unsettling clarity. I often find myself wondering how differently everything might have ended. Sometimes those thoughts spiral into darker possibilities I force myself not to dwell on for too long, because fear has a strange way of feeding itself. And once your imagination starts filling in the blanks, the monsters become far more terrifying than reality ever managed to prove. That experience should have taught me to stay away from places wrapped in mystery. Instead, only a few months later, I found myself drawn toward another mystery, one that seemed harmless at first. Looking back now, I can't help wondering whether curiosity has always been my greatest weakness. The story begins the previous summer. I had started dating a guy who lived nearly an hour away. The relationship wasn't anything special. If I'm honest, it was little more than a rebound after a painful breakup. It lasted only a few months before quietly falling apart. Yet somehow the relationship itself isn't what I remember most. It's the drive. Every weekend I followed the same lonely highway stretching through endless forests and wide open fields where civilization seemed to disappear for miles at a time. There was almost nothing to see. No neighborhoods. No stores. Only abandoned farmland, towering trees, and long ribbons of empty asphalt. Then, about 15 minutes before reaching his house, something emerged on the horizon. Every single time. At first it looked like a mirage, a massive structure rising from the landscape as though it had been forgotten by history itself. The building stood completely isolated. No nearby homes, no visible parking lot, no signs of life. Its steep Gothic rooflines clawed toward the sky. Narrow windows stared outward like hollow eyes. At the highest point stood an enormous, weathered cross silhouetted against the clouds. Even from the highway it radiated an unsettling presence. It looked less like a building, and more like the setting of a nightmare, waiting for someone curious enough to step inside. The first time I saw it, I couldn't stop staring. Every drive afterward, I slowed down just enough to catch another glimpse. Something about it refused to let go of my attention. Finally, one day, I asked my boyfriend what it was. He barely glanced in its direction. No idea. Then he shrugged. I've always assumed it was some old prison or something. He laughed. It's been abandoned my whole life. That answer only made me more curious. How could something so enormous sit in the middle of nowhere for decades, and nobody seemed to know or care what it had once been? That was one of the biggest differences between us. He could drive past a mystery his entire life without giving it a second thought. I only needed to see it once. And suddenly I wanted to know everything. Even after we stopped seeing each other, that strange building continued to invade my thoughts. Sometimes I'd catch myself picturing it for no reason. The empty windows, the towering cross, the unsettling silence surrounding it. Eventually I mentioned it to my best friend Laura. To my surprise, she became just as fascinated as I was. We spent one evening searching online, convinced we'd quickly uncover its history. But the internet offered almost nothing. No clear records, no photographs, no detailed history, just scattered rumors and vague references that answered none of our questions. Most people would have accepted the mystery and moved on. We didn't. And looking back now, I wish we had. Even after hours of searching online, neither Laura nor I could let the mystery go. Most people would have accepted that some places simply refused to reveal their history. We weren't those people. The building had become an obsession. The more we failed to uncover its past, the more it seemed to call to us. It was as though the silence surrounding it wasn't hiding an answer. It was inviting us to come and find one ourselves. One evening, while we were talking about it again, Laura suddenly smiled and said something that should have sounded ridiculous. "Why don't we just drive out there?" She said it so casually, as if she were suggesting we grab coffee. "It's only about an hour away," she continued. "If it's really abandoned, nobody's going to be there." I wish I had argued. I wish I had laughed it off. Instead, I actually thought about it. I've never been the adventurous type. I'm not someone who climbs fences, sneaks into abandoned buildings, or intentionally breaks the law. I'm usually the person reminding everyone else about worst-case scenarios. Looking back now, I can barely recognize the version of myself who agreed to go. Curiosity has an incredible way of disguising itself as harmless excitement. It whispers instead of shouts. It convinces you that nothing bad ever happens. Until it does. My twisted reasoning made perfect sense at the time. If we go in the middle of the night, I said, any security guards will probably be gone. Even as the words left my mouth, I knew how flawed that logic sounded. Darkness doesn't make a place safer. It only hides what you can't see. A few nights later, at exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, we set our plan in motion. Fresh batteries clicked into our flashlights. Laura packed pepper spray just in case. We joked with each other during the drive, pretending we were about to experience some exciting urban exploration adventure. Neither of us admitted the truth. We were both nervous. The farther we drove from civilization, the quieter everything became. Streetlights disappeared. Traffic vanished. Even the radio eventually dissolved into static before we turned it off completely. Outside, the windshield stretched endless fields swallowed by darkness. The building eventually appeared on the horizon, exactly where I remembered it. Only this time, it looked infinitely more disturbing. Moonlight barely touched its towering rooflines. Its narrow windows resembled rows of empty eye sockets staring across the fields. The enormous cross, mounted at the highest point, looked almost black against the cloudy sky. It didn't resemble a place built for hope. It resembled a monument that time itself had abandoned. Laura parked nearly a quarter-mile away along the shoulder of the empty road. "I don't want cameras picking up my license plate," she whispered. That sentence should have been enough to send us home. Instead, we grabbed our flashlights and started walking. The 10-minute hike across the overgrown field felt much longer. The grass reached our knees. Cold wind hissed through dead weeds. Every few seconds, I caught myself looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was following us despite the complete silence. The building grew larger with every step. Soon it towered over us like an ancient fortress. Its walls were stained by decades of rain and neglect. Pieces of brick had crumbled away. vines wrapped around broken stonework like skeletal fingers, refusing to let the structure collapse. Standing beneath it made me feel incredibly small and strangely unwelcome. The massive front doors stood directly ahead. I immediately searched the walls for any plaque sign or faded lettering that might reveal what this place had once been. Nothing. Not a single clue. No name. No warning. No history. It was almost as though someone had intentionally erased its identity. Laura stepped forward. Without hesitation, she wrapped her hand around the rusted handle and pulled. The heavy wooden door creaked open. Slowly, painfully, the sound echoed through the darkness like something awakening after decades of sleep. We froze. Nothing happened. No alarms. No voices. Only silence. An unnatural silence. The air that drifted out carried the overpowering smell of mold, wet stone, and rotting wood. It wasn't simply the smell of an abandoned building. It smelled old. Ancient, as though the air itself hadn't moved in decades. Our flashlight beams sliced through clouds of floating dust. Millions of tiny particles drifted lazily through the darkness like pale insects suspended in time. The beam illuminated cracked walls, peeling paint, rusted pipes, broken furniture. Everything looked frozen in the exact moment people had abandoned it. The entrance hallway led directly toward a thick steel door with bars covering its narrow window. Even before stepping closer, we realized what we were looking at. A prison! The realization settled over both of us without either saying a word. The barred door stood partially open. A massive rusted padlock still hung from the latch, unlocked, swinging gently, as if someone had forgotten to finish locking it, or someone had recently opened it. That thought settled heavily in my stomach. Every instinct told me to turn around. "We've seen enough," I whispered. Laura glanced back with a grin. "We literally just got here." She pushed the barred door wider. The metal hinges screamed loud enough to echo through the entire building. I flinched. The noise seemed impossibly loud inside that endless silence. We continued deeper. Room after room revealed itself beneath our flashlight beams. Old offices, storage rooms, collapsed hallways. Rusted filing cabinets spilled papers across moldy floors. Everywhere we looked, pieces of the ceiling had fallen. Wooden beams sagged dangerously overhead. Broken glass crunched beneath every careful step. The prison wasn't merely abandoned. It was dying. Eventually, the hallway opened into an enormous central block. Rows upon rows of prison cells stretched along both sides of the room. Most stood open. Some hung crookedly from broken hinges. Others remained shut forever behind rusted bars. Our flashlight beams disappeared into their darkness without revealing where the tiny rooms ended. The place felt impossibly large. Every sound lingered for several seconds before fading away. Even our breathing echoed. Laura's excitement only grew stronger. Mine disappeared completely. The deeper we walked, the heavier the atmosphere became. The building no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, not by something I could see, by something I could feel, an overwhelming sensation that we didn't belong. I stopped walking. "Laura." She turned. "I think we should leave." She rolled her eyes. "Already?" I pointed my flashlight upward. Massive cracks zigzagged across the ceiling. Chunks of plaster littered the floor beneath us. This place could collapse. She laughed. "You're such a nervous wreck." She wasn't entirely wrong. But fear exists for a reason. Sometimes it's your brain recognizing danger before you consciously understand it. She sighed dramatically. 5 more minutes. That's it. Against every instinct screaming inside me, I agreed. It couldn't have been more than 3 minutes later. Crash. The explosion of sound shook the entire building. It wasn't a small noise. It sounded enormous, like hundreds of pounds of concrete smashing into the floor. The impact echoed through every corridor, bouncing from wall to wall, until it became impossible to tell where it had originated. Both of us froze instantly. Neither of us spoke. My heart hammered so violently I could hear blood rushing through my ears. Laura swallowed. It was probably part of the building collapsing. She tried to sound confident. She didn't succeed. The confidence in her voice had vanished. I stared at her. That look said everything words couldn't. "We're leaving." Now, without another argument, we turned around and began retracing our steps through the cell block. Neither of us hurried. Neither of us wanted to make unnecessary noise. The silence after the crash somehow felt even worse, as if the building itself were listening. We were almost back to the doorway when Laura suddenly stopped so abruptly that I nearly walked into her. She lifted one trembling hand. "Don't panic," she whispered. Whenever someone begins a sentence with those words, panic has already arrived. What I whispered. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly pointed toward the opposite end of the massive cell block, about 20 feet away. Someone was standing there, perfectly still, a dark human silhouette. No flashlight, no visible movement, no sound, just watching us. Every muscle in my body locked. Being alone inside an abandoned prison is frightening. Realizing you were never actually alone, that's an entirely different kind of terror. Time seemed to freeze. Neither side moved. Neither side spoke. The figure simply remained motionless beneath the darkness at the far end of the corridor. Questions exploded through my mind. How long had they been there? Had they watched us enter? Had they been following us through the prison the entire time? Or had they been waiting? Several endless seconds passed. Then, very slowly, the figure raised both hands into the air. A calm voice echoed across the empty prison. "Easy, my name's Mike. I'm not here to hurt you." Laura reacted instantly. She pulled the pepper spray from her jacket pocket and aimed it directly toward him. "Don't come any closer," she shouted, her voice echoing through the abandoned cell block. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Mike immediately stopped moving. "I work security here," he answered. His tone remained surprisingly calm. Too calm. Almost rehearsed. He pointed toward his chest, though we couldn't clearly see what he was indicating. "I'm the security guard." Those words should have made us feel safer. Instead, they made every alarm bell inside my head ring even louder. Because if this place had truly been abandoned for decades, why would it still need a security guard? The man never raised his voice. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Most people, if they caught two strangers trespassing inside a supposedly restricted building at 1 o'clock in the morning, would sound irritated. They'd yell, demand answers, call the police immediately. He did none of those things. Instead, he smiled, calmly, almost warmly. "My job is to detain anyone who breaks into the property," he explained in a relaxed voice, as though we were simply chatting outside a coffee shop. Normally, I'd call the police and wait for them to arrive. The words should have terrified me. Instead, they strangely comforted me. That was the frightening part. His voice carried an effortless confidence. Every sentence flowed naturally. There wasn't a single hesitation, not one awkward pause, not one contradiction. It sounded like a story he had told dozens of times before. He continued speaking. Apparently, according to him, the building had become a popular destination for thrill seekers and urban explorers. Teenagers kept sneaking inside, vandalizing rooms, stealing old fixtures, and posting videos online. Because of that, security patrols had become necessary. The explanation sounded believable. Too believable. I could actually picture it. Every question we asked was answered immediately. Every concern was met with another smooth explanation. If someone had walked into that conversation halfway through, they probably would have trusted him without a second thought. I almost did. My mind had already begun imagining police cars, trespassing charges, and having to explain all of this to my family. Beside me, however, Laura wasn't buying a single word. She leaned close enough that only I could hear her. "I don't trust him." Her whisper was barely audible. 3 words. Yet somehow they cut straight through the fog that panic had wrapped around my thoughts. Meanwhile, the man who had introduced himself as Mike began walking toward us with slow, measured steps. Not aggressive. Not hurried. Deliberate. He stopped several feet away. I'll tell you what he said with another friendly smile. "You both seem like good kids. I don't think we need to get the police involved tonight." Relief flooded through me so suddenly that I almost laughed. "Really?" He nodded. "I'll just escort you out. Take this as a warning." I immediately started thanking him, over and over. My voice trembled with gratitude. He chuckled softly. "Don't worry about it." His calmness was strangely infectious. For a brief moment, I believed we had gotten unbelievably lucky. Then Laura asked one simple question. "If you're letting us go, can you move out of the doorway so we can leave?" Everything changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. But I did. Something behind his smile shifted, only slightly. His eyes lost a little warmth. The smile remained. The friendliness didn't. "I'm sorry," he replied. "I can't let you leave that way." Laura frowned. "Why not?" He answered almost instantly. "Part of the ceiling collapsed. The hallway you came through isn't safe anymore." He gestured somewhere behind us. "I'll take you through another exit, a much safer route." His explanation arrived so quickly that it almost sounded rehearsed. Laura didn't move. Neither did I. The strange thing was, we hadn't heard anything collapse nearby. Yes, we'd heard that enormous crash earlier, but he was specifically referring to the hallway we'd entered through. Could an entire section really have fallen that quickly? I didn't know. Fear has a remarkable ability to silence common sense. Part of me desperately wanted to believe him. The other part kept whispering that something wasn't right. Still, we followed. Looking back now, that decision still chills me. Instead of leading us toward the front entrance, he guided us deeper into the prison. Far deeper. Every corridor looked more decayed than the last. The walls became darker, the ceilings lower, the air colder. Our flashlight beams revealed endless peeling paint, collapsed masonry, rusted pipes hanging from broken ceilings, and prison doors frozen open like mouths that had been screaming for decades. The farther we walked, the more isolated everything became. I finally looked more carefully at him. Something felt wrong. Not frightening at first, just off. He wasn't dressed like any security guard I had ever seen. No badge, no flashlight clipped to his belt, no radio, no reflective vest.
No company logo?
Nothing. Just faded blue jeans, white sneakers, a black hooded sweatshirt, an old flannel shirt thrown casually over the top. Laura noticed it too. That's kind of an unusual uniform. He laughed. It wasn't defensive. It was almost amused. Oh, this job's boring. They let me wear whatever I want. Again, the answer came instantly. Too instantly. Every explanation seemed perfectly designed to remove doubt before it could fully form. Yet somehow, each answer created even more questions. Minutes continued passing. The prison seemed endless. Every time we asked where the exit was, his response never changed. Almost there. Just another minute. You're gonna be fine. Those words should have been reassuring. Instead, they became increasingly terrifying. Eventually, we reached a narrow corridor unlike anything we'd passed before. It was so tight that two people couldn't comfortably walk side by side. The walls closed in around us. The ceiling felt oppressively low. At the far end stood a heavy steel door. Mike walked forward, slowly opened it. The hinges groaned. Beyond the doorway, darkness. Not ordinary darkness. Complete darkness. Our flashlights barely revealed the first few concrete steps descending into what looked like an underground level. After that, nothing. The staircase simply disappeared into blackness so deep it almost looked solid. Cold air drifted upward. It carried the unmistakable smell of damp earth and stagnant water. Mike stepped aside, completely aside. Then, with another pleasant smile, he extended one arm toward the staircase. After you, neither of us moved. The hallway became perfectly silent. Laura stared at him. Why would we go down there? He laughed softly. Not loudly, not mockingly, almost affectionately. You're being silly. Something about hearing the word silly inside an abandoned prison at 2 a.m. made every instinct inside me scream. There was nothing silly about this. Nothing. Laura finally stood her ground. We're not going downstairs. For the first time, his smile disappeared. Only for a fraction of a second. Then it returned. I stepped forward, trying to keep everything calm. If that's the way out, would you mind leading? The question seemed simple, harmless. Yet it was the first question all night that he didn't answer immediately.
1 second.
2, 3. He simply looked at me. Then he nodded. Sure, he stepped down one stair. Then another. Stopped. Turned back. Oh, I should make sure the door locks behind us. In case someone else breaks in. The explanation sounded absurd the moment he said it. Someone else. At 2 a.m, inside a prison that had supposedly been abandoned for years. Before I could think any further, he climbed back toward us. Everything happened incredibly fast. He reached out. His fingers wrapped gently around my arm. Not painfully, not forcefully, almost guidingly, like someone helping another person down slippery stairs. Come on, I'll help you. The instant his hand touched me, every warning I'd been ignoring exploded inside my head. This wasn't guidance. This was control. Before I could react, Laura screamed. Let her go. She shoved him with every ounce of strength she had. Because she stood slightly higher on the stairs, the push caught him completely off balance. He stumbled backward. His grip released my arm. For one frozen heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Laura looked directly at me. Run, I've never obeyed a command faster. We turned and sprinted. The prison exploded into echoes. Footsteps slammed against cracked concrete. Flashlights bounced wildly through endless corridors. Our breathing sounded deafening. We ran without thinking, without looking back, without speaking. Somehow we found the large cell block again. Rows of rusted prison bars flashed past us. Broken doors, collapsed walls. The room where we'd first met Mike. Then another hallway, another doorway. Finally, the front entrance. We burst through the massive wooden doors into the freezing night air. Only then did something occur to both of us. The hallway Mike claimed had collapsed was completely intact. Not a single fallen beam, not one blocked passage, nothing. He had lied. From the very beginning, we kept running across the open field toward Laura's car. Oddly, we never heard footsteps behind us. No shouting, no pursuit, nothing. Yet the entire time I felt as though someone was only inches away. I could almost feel his hand still resting on my arm, long after he'd let go. We jumped into the car. Doors slammed. Locks clicked. Laura floored the accelerator. Gravel sprayed behind us as we sped onto the empty road. Neither of us spoke for several miles. Every few seconds, one of us checked the rearview mirror. Every pair of distant headlights made our stomachs tighten. We kept expecting to see another vehicle following us through the darkness. None ever appeared. Physically, we had escaped. Mentally, neither of us ever really left that prison. For nearly a week, I tried convincing myself that we'd simply encountered an eccentric security guard. Someone socially awkward. Someone whose behavior had seemed stranger because we'd already frightened ourselves exploring an abandoned prison in the middle of the night. Eventually, guilt pushed me to contact the local police department. I admitted everything. Breaking into the property, meeting a man identifying himself as security, his insistence on leading us into a pitch-black basement. The officer listened quietly. When I finished speaking, there was complete silence. At first, I assumed he was deciding how much trouble I was about to be in for trespassing. Instead, his silence sounded different. Not judgment, not anger. Something closer to disbelief. Or perhaps recognition. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to ask why we had entered the building. It wasn't to lecture us about trespassing. His first question sent a cold wave through my entire body. "Can you describe that man again?" Very carefully. In that moment, I realized the most frightening part of the night might not have been what happened inside the prison. It might have been what the officer already knew before I ever called. The officer was silent for several long seconds after I finished telling him everything. I assumed he was deciding how much trouble we were about to be in for trespassing. Instead, when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. It wasn't angry. It wasn't judgmental. It sounded concerned. The kind of concern people have when they realize you've survived something without fully understanding how close you came to disaster. He leaned back in his chair and asked me to repeat one detail. The man identified himself as security. Yes, he said he worked for the property. Yes, the officer slowly shook his head. No, just one word. But somehow it carried enough weight to make my stomach drop. There are no security guards assigned to that property. I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the explanation. It never came. He continued. That prison has been abandoned for years. No active security. No patrols.
No surveillance cameras.
No overnight staff. The room suddenly felt much colder. I remember blinking several times, convinced I had misunderstood him. But he said. The officer interrupted me before I could finish. I know what he said. Then he looked directly into my eyes. His expression became incredibly serious. Whoever you met that night wasn't supposed to be there. He paused, and whatever his intentions were, they weren't good. My heartbeat became painfully loud. The officer didn't exaggerate. He didn't speculate. He didn't try to frighten me. He simply delivered one sentence with quiet certainty. You and your friend are very lucky to still be alive. Even now, years later, those words still echo inside my head, not because of how dramatic they sounded, because of how calmly he said them, like someone describing a fact that needed no explanation. I drove home in complete silence. Every mile seemed unreal. I replayed every second of that night over and over again. His smile, his confidence, the fake explanations, the impossible stories, the staircase, the darkness below, his hand closing around my arm. For weeks afterward, I kept asking myself the same question. Who was he? He didn't look homeless. He didn't look intoxicated. He didn't appear mentally unstable. His clothes were clean. His hair was neatly cut. His speech was polished. He looked like someone with a normal life. Someone you would pass in a grocery store without giving a second glance, which somehow made everything even more terrifying. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look completely ordinary. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they patiently wait for curious people to walk into isolated places where nobody can hear them scream. I know I'll probably never discover who that man really was. Maybe that's for the best, because unanswered questions leave room for imagination, and imagination is often far crueler than reality. Even today, if I allow myself to think about that night for too long, I can still feel phantom pressure around my arm, almost as though his fingers never completely let go. Sometimes I wake suddenly from sleep, convinced I'm standing once again at the top of that staircase, looking into a darkness that seemed almost alive, wondering what would have happened if Laura hadn't shoved him away, wondering whether anyone would have ever found us. I usually stop those thoughts before they go any further, because some questions don't deserve answers. The only thing that truly matters is that we survived. I thought that experience had permanently changed my understanding of danger. I was wrong. Years later, another encounter would convince me that the truly terrifying people aren't always the ones who threaten you openly. Sometimes they simply know far too much. Several years after moving across the country, I accepted a position as a corrections officer at a county jail. The move had been a fresh start. Nearly 1,000 miles separated me from my hometown. Nobody there knew my family. Nobody knew my childhood. Nobody knew anything about the life I'd left behind. That's exactly how I wanted it. During my first week, I met an inmate named Edgar. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. He wasn't loud. He wasn't intimidating. He wasn't one of those inmates constantly looking for confrontation. In fact, he was the opposite. Quiet, polite, respectful. He always addressed officers as "sir." He followed every instruction, never argued, never raised his voice. If you ignored the prison uniform, he looked like someone you might casually chat with while waiting in line at a hardware store. His file wasn't particularly alarming either. He wasn't incarcerated for assault or homicide. He had violated the conditions of his parole. That was it. Nothing about him suggested he would become the inmate I remembered most. The first strange moment happened completely without warning. I was conducting a routine walkthrough when Edgar casually looked up from his bunk. "How's Stan doing?"
I froze.
My first thought was that I'd misheard him. "I'm sorry." He smiled. "Stan, your brother. How's he doing?" Every muscle in my body tightened. I do have a brother named Stan, but there was no possible reason Edgar should know that. This jail sat nearly 1,000 miles from my hometown. I hadn't mentioned my family to coworkers. Most of them barely knew me. There was absolutely no connection between my personal life and this facility. I stared at Edgar for several seconds. He simply smiled, waiting. Eventually, I convinced myself it had to be coincidence. Stan isn't exactly an uncommon name. Maybe he wasn't referring to my brother. Maybe I had imagined the implication. Without responding, I continued my rounds. But the conversation refused to leave my mind. Several days later, it happened again. I was walking past Edgar's housing unit when he called out to me. "Does Diana still live by the lake?" Everything inside me stopped.
Diana.
My mother's name. And yes, she lived beside a lake. Not near one. On one. I immediately walked back. "How do you know that name?" He blinked innocently. "What name?"
Deanna.
He shrugged. "I don't know." The casual way he answered somehow disturbed me even more. Inside correctional facilities, inmates share information constantly. Rumors spread faster than official announcements. Sometimes they learn details about officers. Sometimes they know surprising things. But this wasn't gossip. This wasn't information anyone could casually overhear. Nobody here knew my mother. Nobody here knew where she lived. Nobody. That night I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe Edgar somehow came from my hometown. Maybe there was a distant family connection. Maybe someone recognized my last name. I searched his file. Birthplace. Previous addresses. Employment history. Arrest records. Nothing. He had lived his entire life in this state. As far as records showed, he had never even traveled anywhere near my hometown. There was simply no overlap, no explanation, no connection. Yet the strange comments continued. One afternoon, while meals were being distributed, Edgar smiled as I walked past. "Your nephew's still playing baseball." The tray nearly slipped from my hands. My nephew was obsessed with baseball. He had been since he was 6 years old. Almost nobody outside my immediate family even knew that. I stared at Edgar, searching desperately for some sign that this was a joke. He only smiled. Not smugly, not mockingly, just patiently, as though he enjoyed watching confusion slowly replace certainty. By that point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I requested a private conversation with my supervisor. I explained everything. The questions, the names, the impossible personal details, the growing feeling that someone had somehow invaded every private corner of my life. She listened carefully, then sighed. "I've seen inmates do this before. They try getting inside officers' heads. They want an emotional reaction. They want you to lose control. If you retaliate, they file complaints, they sue. Don't give him what he wants. Her explanation sounded reasonable. Professionally, it made sense. Emotionally, it explained absolutely nothing, because manipulation only works when the manipulator actually has information. Edgar wasn't making vague guesses. He wasn't fishing for clues. He already knew things he should never have known. I tried following my supervisor's advice. I ignored him, stopped reacting, answered only when necessary. Curiously, Edgar stopped mentioning my family altogether. He remained the perfect inmate, respectful, friendly, calm, almost charming, as though nothing strange had ever happened. That somehow unsettled me more than if he'd continued. Months passed. Eventually, the day of his release arrived. He packed his belongings, completed his paperwork, exchanged a few polite words with staff. As he walked toward the exit, he slowed when he reached me. He smiled one final time, then quietly said, "Maybe I'll see you around." 4 simple words, completely harmless. Yet something about the way he spoke them settled like ice beneath my skin. It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. It sounded more like a promise. After the doors closed behind him, I stood there longer than I care to admit, watching the empty hallway, trying to convince myself I was overthinking everything. Life eventually returned to normal. Months slipped by. Work became routine. I settled into my new apartment. I started dating someone. Several nights each week I stayed at her place, gradually believing the strange chapter involving Edgar had finally ended. Then one quiet morning, while drinking coffee in her kitchen, my phone vibrated. A single notification appeared on the screen. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. Until I read the sender's name, the cup nearly slipped from my hands. Because somehow, against every logical explanation, the nightmare I thought had ended months earlier had just found me again. It started with something so ordinary that I almost deleted the notification without watching it. One quiet morning, while I was having coffee at my girlfriend's apartment, my phone buzzed. "Motion detected at your front door." I opened the Ring app, expecting to see a package delivery or maybe a neighbor needing something. Instead, a hooded man stood perfectly still on my porch. He didn't knock. He didn't look around. He simply stood there. Seconds passed. Then, nearly a full minute. He barely moved. There is something deeply unsettling about watching another human being remain completely motionless. We expect people to fidget, glance around, check their phone, shift their weight. This man did none of those things. It almost looked as though he was listening to the silence inside my house. Eventually he pressed the doorbell. Once then, he continued standing there without moving. Another long stretch of silence followed before he leaned slightly toward the camera. His voice was unusually soft. "You home?" He knew no one had answered. Still, he waited. After another pause, he smiled faintly and gestured over his shoulder. "I've got some meat out in my truck. I'm selling door to door today." He apologized politely for disturbing me, gave one final glance toward the camera, then walked away. At least, that's what I assumed. I didn't think much of it. People occasionally sold frozen meat tools or cleaning supplies around the neighborhood. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of. The only unusual thing was his appearance. His hood stayed pulled low despite the warm weather. Morning sunlight cast heavy shadows across his face, making it impossible to distinguish his features. At the time, I simply chalked it up to an awkward salesman. That assumption lasted exactly one day. The following evening, I stayed at my girlfriend's house again. Sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning, another notification jolted me awake. "Motion detected." Half asleep, I opened the live camera feed. No one. The porch sat completely empty. The motion sensor occasionally produced false alerts. It happened. I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. Looking back now, I don't think it was a false alarm. I think someone had already been there, watching. The next night I stayed home because I had an early shift at the jail. The house was completely quiet. Just after 2 in the morning, the doorbell rang. Once, the sound echoed through the empty house with startling clarity. I immediately grabbed my phone. The live feed loaded. The same hooded figure stood on my porch, exactly where he'd stood before. Exactly the same posture. Exactly the same unsettling stillness. Before I could activate the microphone, he rang the bell again, then leaned toward the camera. "Hello? I've got some meat in my truck. I'm trying to sell it. Anybody home?" His tone hadn't changed. It remained calm, friendly, almost rehearsed. I stared at the screen, growing increasingly irritated. Who tries selling meat at 2 o'clock in the morning? Before I responded, he spoke again. "You should come outside. I'll show you what I've got." Something about that sentence felt wrong, not because of the words, because of the way he emphasized, "Come outside." Then I noticed something that instantly erased every trace of annoyance. His hand slowly drifted toward my front doorknob. He didn't grab it immediately. His fingers hovered above it, testing, considering, watching. A cold wave traveled through my body. Fortunately, my Ring system allowed two-way communication. I pressed the microphone. "This is law enforcement. You need to leave my property immediately. If you don't walk away right now, I'm calling this in." "Silence." He didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't even step backward. Instead, he remained perfectly still. Several agonizing seconds passed. Then, incredibly slowly, he lifted his head. The hood slid back just enough for porch light to illuminate his face. He smiled. The moment I saw that smile, every muscle in my body locked. I knew him. Edgar. The polite inmate. The respectful prisoner. The man who somehow knew my brother's name, my mother's name, where she lived, my nephew's favorite sport. The smile on the monitor wasn't threatening. That somehow made it infinitely worse. It looked almost happy, like he had finally confirmed something he'd wanted to know, that he had found me. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. I couldn't. He already knew exactly who I was. Now he knew where I lived. Finally, he turned around. Slowly, calmly. Not the way someone flees after being caught trespassing. He simply walked away, almost leisurely. I kept watching the live feed, waiting for him to climb into the truck he'd supposedly mentioned. No truck ever appeared. No parked vehicle. No headlights. No engine starting. He just continued walking, farther, farther, until darkness swallowed him completely. The image stayed on my screen long after he disappeared. That detail disturbed me more than anything else. If there had never been a truck, then why invent such a pointless lie? Unless the truck had never been the point. Maybe the conversation itself was. Maybe he only wanted to know whether anyone was home. Or perhaps he wanted me to open the door. I reported everything immediately. Despite working in corrections, I suddenly felt strangely helpless. Edgar had never displayed violent behavior while incarcerated. He had been cooperative, respectful, model behavior. Yet none of what he was doing now resembled rational behavior. It resembled obsession. The following morning, I called my brother Stan. I asked whether he had ever known anyone named Edgar. He immediately said no. Just to be certain, I texted him Edgar's booking photograph. Minutes later, he replied, "Never seen this guy in my life." That answer should have reassured me. Instead, it deepened the mystery. If Edgar had no connection to my family, how had he known so much? I spent the next several evenings digging through every public record I could legally access. The results only became stranger. No known family members. No stable employment history. No confirmed permanent residence. Even his listed address turned out to be vacant. His parole officer had already documented that he wasn't living there. It was as though the man existed only on paper. Every trail seemed to vanish. Every lead reached a dead end. The deeper I searched, the less real he seemed. Eventually, I convinced myself he'd simply moved away. Maybe another city. Maybe another state. Maybe he'd finally lost interest. Life slowly settled into something resembling normal again. Then about a month later, the doorbell rang in my girlfriend's house. It was approximately 10:30 at night. Neither of us had been expecting visitors. The sound startled both of us. "I'll get it," I said. I hurried to the front door, assuming someone had mistaken the address. I opened it immediately. No one. The porch sat completely empty. Cool night air drifted inside. Something felt wrong. I stepped outside and looked down the street. Far in the distance, someone walked away beneath the streetlights. The figure matched Edgar's height, his build, even the slow rhythm of his walk, but darkness concealed every important detail. "Hey!" I shouted. The person never looked back, never slowed, never acknowledged hearing me, just kept walking, steadily, patiently, as though he had already accomplished whatever he'd come to do. For one irrational moment, I considered chasing him. I didn't. People walk through that neighborhood late at night all the time. Maybe it wasn't Edgar. Maybe I was allowing fear to shape what I thought I saw. I returned inside, locked every door, checked every window, pretended everything was fine. My girlfriend asked who had been outside. Nobody. That was easier than trying to explain the truth. I stayed awake until sunrise, watching, listening, waiting for another knock that never came. That turned out to be the last time I ever believed I saw him. At least, the last confirmed time. Edgar seemed to disappear completely afterward. No further sightings. No more strange visitors. No additional messages. Nothing. It was almost as though he'd simply dissolved into the background of the world. Sometimes I wonder whether he was arrested under another identity somewhere else. Sometimes I wonder whether he's still wandering from town to town, quietly inserting himself into strangers' lives before disappearing again. And sometimes I wonder whether he's still watching from somewhere I haven't noticed yet. The truth is, what haunted me wasn't simply that Edgar found my house. It was everything that came before it. How did he know Stan's name? How did he know my mother's name was Diana? How did he know she lived beside a lake nearly 1,000 miles away? There has never been an explanation that satisfies me. No investigation ever uncovered one. No co-worker admitted leaking information. No public record accounted for those deeply personal details. The mystery remained exactly where it began, unanswered. Even now, years later, I still call my mother more often than I used to. Sometimes, without telling her why, I remind her to keep her doors locked, to ignore unexpected visitors after dark, to never answer the door simply because someone seems polite. She laughs and tells me I'm worrying too much. I always laugh with her. I never tell her the real reason, because the image I can't erase isn't Edgar standing on my porch. It isn't his smile through the camera. It isn't even the strange questions he asked inside the jail. It's the possibility that one evening, while I'm hundreds of miles away, he might decide to knock on her door instead. That fear has stolen years of peaceful sleep from me. Every unexpected notification on my phone still makes my pulse race. Every late-night knock still sends me toward the window instead of the door. Every unfamiliar face in a parking lot makes me look twice. People often ask what the scariest part of working in corrections was. They expect stories about riots, violent inmates, or dangerous confrontations. They're always surprised by my answer. The most frightening person I ever encountered never threatened me, never raised his voice, never attacked me. He simply knew things he never should have known, found places he never should have found, and then vanished so completely that to this day I still can't decide which possibility is more terrifying, that he carefully planned every encounter, or that somewhere, somehow, he's still out there quietly learning someone else's life, one impossible detail at a time.